I'm going to talk to you all about my experience bringing these cases, starting out with an early case that I handled fairly early on after I became an elder abuse prosecutor, giving you some background on what was happening in my county at the time. And then I want to have a discussion with you about why we need a multidisciplinary response to elder abuse cases in our jurisdictions, whichever they are, whether they're rural or urban or in between. And then I'll talk a little bit about the multidisciplinary response in King County that has developed over the years, and then finally end with a recent case for the purposes of sharing sort of a comparison between how that early case was handled when there was very little collaborative response in our county to more recently when the multidisciplinary response has improved. So the early case, first of all, the background for me is I'm in Seattle, Washington. I'm with the King County Prosecutor's Office. Our county is pretty big, 2.271 million people, 2,130 square miles, so it's large, very diverse. And Seattle is by far the biggest city in the county. But what is more complex about our situation is that we get referrals at our office from 39 different police agencies. So trying to do training on elder abuse is challenging at best. But Seattle Police Department is the largest and has been a long time ally for us on these cases. But back when my position was created in 2001, I was assigned the sort of three main tasks. One was to prosecute these cases. And at that time, of those 39 police agencies, only Seattle Police had a dedicated elder abuse advocate and detective. There were no other advocates in the county or in any other cities in the county. And my job was also to coordinate the community response and to train and build relationships with law enforcement, because my boss had the wisdom to know that the cases weren't going to be coming into our office until we'd worked on those other things, on training and on coordinating the many different police agencies and services that were available to victims. There were no elder abuse advocates and community-based agencies at that time. We had no elder abuse advocacy in our office. And other than Seattle Police Department, there were very few financial exploitation and neglect cases being responded to at all by law enforcement because there were no dedicated detectives. So I want to bring you now to this early case that happened in that context. And the victim of that case was a man named Leon, and he was 79 years old. He lived alone in Seattle. He had one son who lived out of town, and as is very common, I'm sure this will resonate with many of you, as is very common in our cases, he was widowed. He had recently lost his wife to lung cancer. And in response to her death, he had withdrawn from his son and from his family and kind of everyone, and become quite isolated and I think lonely. So he put his wife's Cadillac up for sale by parking it in his front yard with a for sale sign in the window. And at that point, a man named Michael came to the door and offered him $100 down for the car and promised him that he would make payments of $100 a month after that. And Leon readily agreed. So he took the $100 cash, gave Michael the title to his car, and despite the fact that they had no written contract, Michael drove away with his car, with his wife's car. 2 days later, Michael returned, and this time he brought someone he said was his cousin, and her name was Yana. And Yana began to visit Leon from that point on quite regularly, and she would bring her daughter with him, and she would talk to him about his past career as a caterer, and she was very kind to him and very flirtatious. And I think for the first time in a long time, Leon had company and was sort of excited about life and about, and his loneliness was reduced. And Yana began to talk to Leon about this catering business that she coincidentally worked for. And she talked about the fact that she wanted to get an investment from Leon in the business, and that she wanted him to help her really build this business. And so Leon was very excited about the fact that he could return to being sort of having a meaningful life and to being an investor and to doing catering again. And over the span of 6 months, he gave her basically his life savings, $190,000 in cash, which she insisted on to invest in this business. Eventually, after all of that money had been withdrawn, Leon's son saw the withdrawals in the bank account and talked to his dad, and over Leon's objection, called the police and APS and reported what was happening. Seattle police, which thankfully had this elder abuse detective, responded, and they began to investigate, and they learned that both of these suspects were people that were known to us from past elder abuse cases. So they began their work on the case and did a very thorough investigation of Leon's exploitation. The APS investigation ended in a closure because Leon did not meet Washington's definition of vulnerable adult. And I think that was due to lack of adequate capacity screening for Leon. So there was just a very minimal screening test that was given him. He knew he was oriented ×3, essentially. His house was clean. He was able to cook his own meals and go to the grocery store. And based on that, he simply did not meet their definition at the time of vulnerable adult. We went ahead with a capacity evaluation of Leon, and we learned that he had moderate dementia and significant impairment of his executive function. This was not noticeable when you would talk to him. He was very, verbal and very talkative and very much engaged. And I think that was part of the reason that APS did not see that or detect that dementia that he clearly suffered. After the investigation by Seattle police, we filed charges. Against Michael, we filed theft of motor vehicle with vulnerable victim aggravator and trafficking and stolen property because he then resold the car to someone else. Against Yana, we filed multiple counts of felony theft with vulnerable victim aggravators for her theft of the $190,000 from Leon. And that was based on a theft by deception theory because clearly we could prove that the catering business was fictitious, that was a lie, and that Leon gave her that money based on those lies. And I would also add that over the course of the investigation and through the work of the Seattle police advocate and the detective and me, Leon began to trust us and began to cooperate. And by the end of the investigation was very, very supportive of the prosecution. So Yana pled guilty pretty quickly and was sentenced to a good prison sentence, was ordered to pay restitution. Michael, though, decided he was going to go to trial. And so over the next few months while he was in custody, we prepared for trial, and eventually the trial went forward. Leon testified despite his dementia. He had, as is true, I've noticed of many older victims with dementia, had taken notes around the time of the incident. And for him, the car theft was a very significant part of the trauma. So he had written down sort of the amounts that he'd given Michael and the promises Michael had made to him and the dates that it had occurred. And so with that note, we were able to refresh his recollection, and he was able to testify quite effectively about what had happened. He still got pretty confused on cross-examination, but if anything, I think that helped the jury understand how vulnerable he was. The capacity evaluator testified, the detective, the patrol officer, and Leon's son also testified. So it was a pretty straightforward case. And after, I think, about 4 days of trial, the jury deliberated and they came back guilty on both counts. Michael was sentenced to prison. He was ordered to pay restitution. By all accounts, it was really a successful prosecution for us, and I was thrilled with the outcome. But what I did also notice at the same time was that after the trial, Leon went home alone. His life savings were gone. It was very unlikely he would ever get restitution because Michael and Yana kind of lived under the radar, did not hold conventional jobs, and would likely never have their wages garnished. There was no APS involvement, no services were offered to Leon, and no one stepped forward and offered to manage his money, nor did we have anyone to do money management for him. There was no power of attorney put in place, no guardianship. So really, Leon was left in the same position he was in before the exploitation began. And I was pretty haunted by that because I felt like even though we'd had this conviction, some things were missing from that experience, at least for Leon. But I wanted to put this question to you all and hope that you can put this in the chat, and then Shelley or Talitha can read to me what your comments are. But we were able to obtain this conviction, but do you all think we achieved justice for Leon by getting that conviction? And if so, or if not, if you could just give me some thoughts as to why or why not.
I'm seeing some notes come through.
Great.
Some people are saying, yes, this is justice, but there's still a vulnerability to re-victimization. Others are saying that justice doesn't look the same for everyone,
Mhm.
but you did what you needed to do to protect the public from these predators. Others are saying, no, he was found to have capacity concerns and they don't understand about the follow up. Others are saying it's great that they went to prison, but he didn't get his money back. So I think there's some really complex views on what justice is and how Leon and the public were both served.
Thanks, Tilly. That's great. And I think those are really thoughtful comments. And really what I was thinking too is like, yeah, we did get this victory, but what were we really doing for him? And it was just kind of a mixed bag. So what that led me to wonder about is, why? Like why isn't this is a traditional in a traditional prosecution sense cases that that requires something more.
I have a note from Susan that says elder abuse is not a traditional prosecution, and that justice can be done even when when a person's not completely restored and is still vulnerable.
Okay, great. What else? Like what is it about these cases though that does mean justice might require more than simply a conviction? Any other thoughts about that?
We have comments that are saying prevent.
Okay, I'm going to keep going, but if you guys have thoughts as we're going, and Talitha, time is looking like it's sufficient, feel free to jump in and let me know what additional thoughts people are having about this. I think it took me a very long time to try to put into words what's different about these cases, and this is what I've come up with. But again, I'd love to hear more from you all. The focus of the criminal justice system is not on the victim. We're really not oriented towards the victim. We're oriented around the defendant. There's no jurisdiction over the victim, no ability to um, obtain services for a victim through a criminal process. The only real orders that a court makes that even pertain to the victim are no contact orders and restitution. Everything else is centered around the defendant. And the victim has no power in the criminal process to decide whether charges will be filed, what charges will be filed, and how the case is resolved. I think with elder abuse prosecutors, we are getting better and better at listening to victims and taking their opinions and their desires more and more into account in whether and how we file charges and how a case is resolved. But traditionally, that's not something that has played a really significant role in how we've handled cases. Um, and I think part of the reason for this is because part of what makes these cases different is that older victims tend to have complex and multiple needs. So they don't just need the offender to be prosecuted. They may have medical needs, healthcare needs. They may well have social needs. They may have legal needs, financial needs, mental health needs. So many of our victims have dementia, at least some degree of dementia, that's a huge issue in many of our cases. And they may have housing issues. So there's an array of problems that very often come up for older people who are victimized. And then these cases also often involve multiple investigations. We might have a lot of different agencies who are responding to a case like this, if we're lucky. We may have APS, we may have the prosecutor, law enforcement. We may have an elder law attorney who's working on a guardianship or a conservatorship. If the case happened in a facility or if the perpetrator was a healthcare provider, we may have state licensing agencies involved. And if the case is a financial case that might be multi-state, we could have the FBI, the Postal Inspector's Office, the Social Security Administration, the U.S. Attorney's Office involved. Just as an aside, in King County, we are having incredible success with working with our U.S. Attorney's Office, and it's so amazing to see in some of the elder scam cases how much collaboration between us and the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office can bring to these cases and the ways they can help, that collaboration can help these victims. So the investigations themselves can also be very complex. And we also know that these cases often involve numerous complex subjects. Cognitive capacity, undue influence. These are things that are not taught in the police academy, not taught in law school typically. We usually have some kind of civil legal documents involved. We have healthcare records that may be voluminous and complicated. There may be, again, a guardianship or a conservatorship or a trust, protection orders. And there may be medical issues like bruising and injuries, pressure sores, over medication, under medication. In a neglect case, we may have to determine what is a sign or symptom of neglect versus what's underlying disease process or just normal aging. And then always we have the specter of dementia, or almost always in our cases. And then we also may have extensive financial transactions. And none of these things are limited to one type of elder abuse, because as we all know so well, so many times we see various forms of elder abuse co-occurring. So we may have all of these things involved in a case that lands on a detective's desk or a prosecutor's desk. So these cases are really hard, and because they have so many different issues that they typically involve. And so in order to understand them and in order to respond to them effectively and ethically, we have to collaborate with experts. We simply don't have, as prosecutors, we don't have the knowledge or the ability to deal with these many issues alone. And some common experts that we turn to in our office are geriatricians, capacity evaluators. In almost every case, we're looking at whether or not the victim had capacity, because usually in our cases, the defense that is raised most often is consent. And in Leon's case, that is also what happened. Both Leon and Yana raised with us that this is what Leon wanted. He wanted to give money to Michael for the car. He wanted to give money to Yana. And so we have to look at whether or not the victim had the capacity to understand what it was they were allegedly consenting to. In any case involving neglect or abuse of some kind or assault, we're looking to wound care experts to help us understand what happened to the victim, especially when they may have dementia and can't tell us what happened to them. And then in almost all of these cases where we have a financial component, where we are turning to forensic accountants to get them to analyze the records and help us understand what happened to the money. And that is another area where we are so, we, at least in my office, are completely dependent on our forensic accountants. I'm not a math person by any means. And so when I get a case, I have the luxury of giving these, hundreds, if not thousands of pages of financial records to our forensic accountants, who then look at them, take the information, put it into spreadsheets, and are able to tell us what happened to the money in a way that is incontrovertible. And it's basically they're putting the money, the information into Excel. Excel is analyzing the data, and we come out with a very clear picture of what happened to the victim's money and how the suspect or the defendant obtained that money. So it's really wonderful information for us, but we are very dependent on those experts. And I know that a lot of jurisdictions don't have the luxury of having financial analysts or forensic accountants. And it's just something that we desperately need in our field. Elder law attorneys are also really crucial for our cases. And so many of them, we turn to elder law attorneys to file guardianships or conservatorships to help us get a power of attorney for a trusted family member to take over the elder's assets so that they can be protected. There's just a myriad ways that elder law attorneys end up playing a very important role in our cases. And then in order to really understand what a victim needs and to implement what they need, we need the input and the assistance of other involved professionals. And this is APS investigators, this is advocates if we have them, case managers if we have them, the victim's healthcare team, again, civil attorneys, the detective, and more the capacity evaluator who will make oftentimes recommendations about what the victim needs. And in King County, we're starting to use money managers in many of our cases, and they've become crucial partners in helping us help these victims. And for those of you who aren't familiar with money managers, partners in our helping victims in these cases. But I know, despite the fact that we are now seeing MDTs in every state, which is amazing, and we've come so far, we still are in a situation where most communities don't have MDTs, and most communities don't have someone to help coordinate these investigations and these services for elder abuse victims. So we still have a tremendous need to keep moving forward and to keep progressing in this battle, in this struggle to try to coordinate efforts and coordinate services and investigations for victims throughout the country. So in King County, I just want to take you back to where we were after Leon's case and sort of what happened since then. With sort of in 2002, so not long after I was appointed, I, along with our chief medical examiner, formed the King County Elder Abuse Council. And that group met every month. We had no funding for it besides my position. And our goal was to bring together the heads of various agencies that work with older adults in the county to improve our systemic response to elder abuse. And that council didn't staff individual cases, and it, didn't. There weren't like a long list of contributions that I think we made to the county, but what we did do was we built relationships. And so we began to meet regularly then with Adult Protective Services, and we began to meet regularly together with our different agencies that worked with older adults and with law enforcement. And it was those relationships that I think really built the foundation for us to start building a more effective multidisciplinary response to victims in King County. And it was because of those relationships that we built, that in 2009, we applied for and were awarded the Abuse in Later Life grant from the Office on Violence Against Women. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. Andy mentioned it earlier this morning. But this is a grant that I work on now and have continued to work on since 2009, actually before that. And it trains different players in the criminal justice system to respond to elder abuse. So there's a component that trains patrol officers, a component that trains detectives, adult protective services investigators, social service providers, judges, and prosecutors. And there's different trainings that have been created for each field. And it also works on improving the systemic response to cases of elder abuse in your jurisdiction that is awarded the grant. And then finally, it develops a plan and provides funding for improving victim services in your county or in your jurisdiction. And it was through this grant that I think we really began to make a difference in our county. We went out there and trained hundreds of police officers and detectives. We applied for the grant and were awarded the grant along with partners, and those partners were APS, a domestic violence advocacy organization, Seattle Police Department, and our office. And so we partnered, and through that partnership and working on the grant, we also built our relationships even further. So it just served so many purposes to strengthen how we worked on these cases and how we responded together on these cases. And as far as the victim services component of it, what we did was in 2011, we funded an elder abuse case manager position at our area agency on aging, which is Aging Disability Services in King County in Seattle. And that position, I think, was, well, I know was a game changer for us, because that case manager was someone who began to work on an ongoing basis with elder abuse victims on cases that we filed or didn't file, but it really required us to refer the case to their office. And the elder abuse case manager continues to be in existence. Since then, our AAA has funded a second full-time case manager, and our office and the police and APS now routinely refer cases to these case managers. And there was simply nothing else like it in our county. And it was because of this OBW grant that we were able to create these positions. And it's just been amazingly important for us. So it's, so in a lot of cases, we will make a referral to these case managers where we've got someone who clearly needs help, but who either may be refusing help, who may not qualify as a vulnerable adult by APS, or whose needs are simply so complex that they need different levels of help and different layers of help. And it's not something that we have the ability as prosecutors to give them. And then another sort of game changer for us was that in 2019, our county funded an elder abuse MDT for us. And this was a 5-year grant through our Veterans and Human Services levy. And it funded initially a half-time prosecutor, a full-time financial analyst, which again, we use in the majority of our cases, and a full-time MDT coordinator. And in those 5 years, we have really come a long way in working on not only on individual cases and helping individual victims, but on improving our systemic response to these cases. And it's just been, for me, like a real realization of the dreams and the hopes I had for how we could begin to respond to elder abuse better and more fully in our county. So the initial partners for our MDT were our elder abuse prosecutors, and by then we had 2, thanks to the OVW grant, we kind of had to, because our workload increased so much, appoint a second elder abuse prosecutor. And then we had this financial investigator who joined our office through the MDT funding. We had a half-time advocate. So our team within our office was building as a result of all of this multidisciplinary response and community work. Because the MDT was funded, the King County Sheriff's Office agreed to appoint a detective as a full-time elder abuse detective. And she investigates cases throughout King County. Also joining the team was our AAA supervisor and elder abuse case managers, APS supervisors, and APS by this time had really become a partner in our cases and was referring many of their cases not only to the AAA, but also to the MDT when they were having trouble with them. And so it just was a turning point for us as far as collaboration between these essential agencies. And so we evolved, and over the next 5 years, we added a number of other agencies that really, I think, has bolstered the MDT. We have a group in King County called the Geriatric Regional Assessment Team that conducts in-home mental health assessments for older adults. They're not exactly capacity evaluations, but they're evaluations that we can still use in our cases, in our criminal cases, and that certainly help us determine what kind of care an older person needs. Our Developmental Disabilities Administration also joined the team. And then I think most significantly, the Swedish hospital geriatricians joined our team. So we have Carrie Rubenstein, who runs their geriatrics fellowships program. She joined our team and brought with her her fellows who were studying learning geriatrics and working as geriatricians at Swedish Hospital. And they began coming to all of our meetings several years ago. And they started asking us about different victims that we were working on. And then they were able to access their records because we have confidentiality in our team. And they were able to bring what they knew about the medical issues the victim was dealing with. And then eventually they started actually going out to see the victim. And so they would go out to see the victim along with the AAA case manager and along with oftentimes Adult Protective Services and the detective. And we really evolved to become a much more hands-on group that wasn't just consulting with cases as we had been initially, but was really working on these cases together. And I think that is what has allowed us, I think, to really make a difference in a lot of victims' lives. So the referrals began to increase as we evolved. The community relationships began to be strengthened even more, and we began to offer more as far as services for victims were concerned. Our case managers brought in money managers and now are routinely bringing in money managers to victims of financial exploitation, offering case management. We're conducting capacity evaluations in most of the cases we see. And we're seeing these Swedish geriatricians going out on house calls to see these victims and work with them and make sure that their healthcare needs are being met, and also help us with capacity issues that we're dealing with. The team also began much more focused on staffing these cases on an ongoing basis. So many of our cases go on for months, and we're hearing back from the different players in these meetings about how the victim is doing, what progress is being made, and also oftentimes helping, if it's a case where we think guardianship is needed, we're helping get the information that APS needs to justify filing a guardianship or conservatorship petition. So it's really changed our response dramatically to have all of these different players involved.
Paige?
Yeah.
We have a few questions that I thought might
Great.
be better suited for this moment. We have people asking a lot of questions about capacity evaluations, wanting to know their role in your work and how to access them, and what professions generally can provide them.
So that's a big, I think it's a crucial question. I'm so glad you asked that. And it's something that the Elder Justice Initiative has done some work on and is continuing to work on. And I think it's so important. So what we have done in King County is we have tapped a woman who's a licensed social worker, actually, who worked originally for the Geriatric Regional Assessment Team and did in-home mental health assessments, but now is a geriatric care consultant in practice on her own. And through the funding for the MDT, we're able to pay her to do these capacity evaluations. Sometimes APS is also able to pay her, and sometimes we also get the geriatricians from Swedish hospitals to do the capacity evaluations. So we've got some resources, still not enough for us, but I know what we have is a lot compared to what a lot of jurisdictions have. So I think this is something we need to keep working on, but I think looking at who elder law attorneys use in your community to do assessments for guardianships and conservatorships is one thing to look at. Looking at who APS is using and using their capacity evaluators. And also if you don't have someone who has expertise in that area, finding out who the geriatricians are in your community, and they can conduct those capacity evaluations in many cases. So that's who I would start with. But I think it's a really important need that we need to be developing in all of our communities, because we can't know, in a prosecution, we have to know a lot of times if a victim, when the defendant claims the victim consented, and the victim may say they consented, we have to know if they had the capacity to consent to whatever is at issue in the criminal case. And we have to know what their capacity is to figure out what kind of care they need and what kind of services they need. Anything else, Talitha?
I have a question about the role of the money manager, if you could expand on that.
Great. So this is pretty new for us, and it was something that our AAA started doing through their case managers. They actually got a VOCA grant to work on, to sort of fund services for victims, and through that hired a money manager. And he, in a number of our cases now, has, in one case I'll be talking about tomorrow in my presentation, has, and also actually in today, in the rest of, at the conclusion of this presentation, was able to start working with these victims. And I think a lot of times the victims will agree to work with them because they know that if they don't, they're looking at a guardianship or a conservatorship. So it's a much more palatable remedy for them, understandably. But the money manager is someone who is kind of works with them as a peer and goes to their home and gains their trust and convinces them to let them help with their finances. And over time, in the cases I've worked on with the money manager, he has gained their trust so much that they are willing to essentially allow him to pay their bills and to make their significant financial decisions for them. And I think it's something, again, we need to be talking about more because it's just done wonders for our cases. And it's allowed us not to rely just on the sort of dramatic response of filing a petition for a guardianship or conservatorship. It's a much less aggressive thing to do and obviously much less expensive and requires much fewer resources. And these money managers are vetted through, I don't know the name of their organization, but they have licensing, I think, through a money management organization. And so they're accredited through that organization, and their credentials are checked and their criminal histories are checked. So there are safeguards put in place before they're allowed to work on a case. So that's something else to really think about. And if any of you would like the connection, I'm happy after, if you want to email me or call me, I can connect you to our money managers that we use, and they can talk to you further about how to find them in your community.
I think there's just two more quick questions
Okay.
that are kind of related. One is around the in-home mental health assessments and capacity assessments, and the other services that you're able to provide. I'm wondering how they work and how they are funded. So how are you able to get funding for the assessments?
So because we were lucky enough to get funding from our county for our MDT, we were able through the MDT to fund those capacity assessments. Also, sometimes APS is able to pay for them. And then also our AAA was able to pay for some of them through their VOCA funding. I think we've lost that VOCA funding, so I'm not sure what the future is going to look like, but we've been lucky enough that our county has funded enough of it that we were able to do that. Also, occasionally the prosecutor's office, my office, has been able to pay for capacity assessments when we've needed them on criminal cases. We usually end up having those capacity evaluators testify at our trials. And so they are considered an expert, and we pay them the way we pay for other needed experts on criminal cases. But again, I know there's not enough funding for this, and this is something we really need to be collaborating on and talking about, because these capacity evaluators are not just crucial for victims, but they're crucial for us as prosecutors to help us make ethical decisions on whether we should be filing charges and how to file charges. We've had some cases where, family members have gotten very upset about who an older person has given their money to. And once we've gotten the evaluation of that victim, we found out that actually they're fine and they have capacity and we have the right to do what we want with our money. So the capacity evaluation really helps us figure out not just, does this victim have capacity to make this decision, but are we as prosecutors making ethical and responsible charging decisions? And should we be filing charges in some of these cases? So I can't emphasize enough how important that is.
And I think I'll just ask one more and then you can
Okay.
continue. You can ask some more at the end. But this one was really interesting. Wondering if this client, Leon, did have capacity to decide about the car and the funds for the catering business, but maybe didn't have the executive functioning or the capacity to adequately protect his investments like that. I think it's trying to get at that delicate balance of what do you have capacity to do, and can you have this sort of variable capacity?
Great question. So we know that financial capacity, the capacity to make complex financial decisions, is one of the first things that goes in the course of dementia. I believe our capacity evaluator who evaluated Leon found that he lacked financial capacity, but it clearly wasn't bad. I mean, it was not so obvious that we could say that our theory could be that Michael and Yana knew that he lacked capacity. APS didn't pick it up, so there's no way we could have proven that in court. His doctors hadn't picked it up. So our theory, we had her testify just to show how vulnerable Leon was and to show why he believed these lies and why he was sort of so gullible to being exploited. And also to proving the vulnerability, which we needed to for the vulnerable victim aggravators that we'd filed. But it wasn't enough that was the theory of our case, that we could show that he lacked capacity and couldn't make those financial decisions. Whether he had capacity to decide to give Michael the money versus making an investment decision, I don't think we got that specific with our evaluator. Her main point was just that he had dementia, he was vulnerable, he didn't really understand complex financial transactions. And because that wasn't really our basic theory, that he lacked capacity, we didn't really need to go further with her as far as the nuances of his financial incapacity, if that makes sense. And again, on any of these questions, you guys, and we can ask hopefully more questions at the end, but feel free to reach out to me and we can talk about it more in depth as to your cases offline and later on. Anything else, Talitha, or should I keep going?
I think we can go on, and then I'll hold some of these other great questions till the end.
Okay, great. So I'm going to bring you now to a more current case, and I think hopefully it will show sort of what our MDT has been able to accomplish, and I think how we've been able to help these victims better than we were able to help Leon. So I got a case a few years ago involving Teresa, and she, at the time of the incident, was 69 years old, suffered from a traumatic brain injury that was a lifelong impairment for her. She was very easily confused about money and really about many things, and I think very obviously impaired. She had a lot of very hard time communicating with people, especially about money. But she had, done well enough in life that she'd gotten married. She had 2 kids who lived nearby, Travis and Tracy. And in her marriage, she and her husband had bought a home. And after the divorce, she was able to keep that home. So she lived in her own home, which was her pride and joy for many years. In June of 2020, a homeless shelter social worker called 911 to report that a year before, Teresa's son Travis had actually sold Teresa's home and stolen the proceeds of the home. She said Teresa was homeless. She was living in a motel in Seattle. Her home was actually outside the Seattle city limits, so the case went to the King County Sheriff's Office. And a sergeant there the case had been reported to them, but a sergeant had thought the case was civil, and so the case had not been assigned to a detective. Additional reports ended up being made over that summer, and eventually the case went to a detective who reached out to me, and we began to collaborate on the investigation. APS also opened an investigation. They did not screen Teresa out, and they started to work on the case as well. And so we all collaborated as the investigation developed. They conducted witness interviews. They interviewed the suspect. They got the financial records involving what happened with the sale of Teresa's home. And what the investigation revealed was that Teresa had worked for many, many years full-time as a gas station attendant at the 7-Eleven. And she had stayed afloat despite the fact that her mortgage was pretty high and she was sometimes late with her mortgages, but she would have people come and live with her and pay rent off and on. Sometimes they would exploit her. Sometimes they had drug problems. It wasn't a great situation. But I think she was very protective of them and very protective of her autonomy. So she historically was not interested in cooperating with the police whenever this exploitation would be reported. In August of 2019, what we know was that Teresa's home was sold for $368,000 to a third party. And after her mortgage was paid off and she had some credit card debt, after that was paid off, about $150,000 remained. The next month, $133,000 of that money was wired out of her account and into Travis's bank account. Soon after that, Travis and his wife moved to Hawaii, and by January of 2020, all of that money was gone. What Teresa had told us was that Travis had told her to move out of her house for a little while so he could fix it up for her. He played on the fact that she was having trouble paying her mortgage every month. And so he was saying, this will help you and we can make your house better. And he said the house would be transferred to him. So he would, make sure that everything was taken care of and he would pay her bills. And she didn't understand the documents she signed. Obviously, she signed all the purchase and sale documents, but she trusted her son implicitly. And so she assumed he was taking care of her and wanted the best for her and went ahead with the purchase and sale of the home. At the time we got the case, she was living in a hotel. She was taking 3 buses to work and another bus to the food bank, living in a very seedy part of town, really on the edge of making it. I think her wallet was stolen multiple times. She would spend like an hour or 2 just to get to work and then another hour to get to the food bank. She was very understandably angry and very mistrustful of the system, very angry at her children. Her daughter Tracy had actually been part of the exploitation initially, although we weren't able to charge her. So she'd really been betrayed by, everyone who was important to her. So the case came into me, and I referred it immediately to the MDT because it was far beyond what I could do as far as helping Teresa was concerned. And the MDT began a protracted effort to assign individual people to work with Teresa. The AAA case manager started working with Teresa and building trust with her. She coordinated with APS on APS's investigation, and they also coordinated with a detective and with me. And we really together worked on the case on what additional investigation we needed as prosecutors and on what services Teresa needed on how we could convince her to let us help her as best as we could. In October of 2021, we filed felony charges against Travis for identity theft, theft from a vulnerable adult, 2 counts of that, and mortgage fraud. Travis was still living in Hawaii at that time. He didn't show up for his arraignment, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. Also at that time, we hired a capacity evaluator for Teresa. Mainly, we didn't really need it to prove our case because it was so obvious that she was impaired when you talked to her. So it was important to our case, but we were able to prove that even just by having Teresa testify. But what we needed to figure out was what kind of services she needed, because she was still so resistant and struggling. And she would just say to us over and over again, I just want. And that was something we obviously couldn't do for her. So we needed to figure out what kind of legal remedies were needed. APS needed to figure out if a guardianship was appropriate, how to provide her with healthcare and protection in the future. Meanwhile, the warrant remained outstanding for Travis. We couldn't find him in Hawaii, and it was just a really difficult prosecution because we were not able to get our hands on him to bring him back to Washington, much to my frustration and even more to Teresa's frustration. APS then made a finding of financial exploitation against Travis, which allowed them to think about legal remedies for Teresa. And in May of 2022, by this time, the AAA was really starting to embrace money managers. And with their help, we hired a money manager, actually with VOCA funding, to work with Teresa, and a man named Randy, who is a wonderful money manager for us, started working with her. And not only did he manage her money, but he really became her advocate. And so he was the one I would call when he needed advice on how to proceed with a case. And when we were negotiating the case, he was the one who helped her, help prevent her from being evicted from her hotel, which was happening because she was angry and difficult. He ended up finding a long-term care facility for her. And eventually she agreed to work with him completely and to let him handle her finances completely, which avoided a guardianship, so that APS didn't even need to file for a guardianship for her. So we finally had this protection for her that was so desperately needed. And then our MDT detective began to work with marshals, US Marshals and the Hawaii police to locate Travis in Hawaii. And eventually he was extradited to Washington. And once he came into court, he was released on bond that he had posted. So in January of 2024, he finally pled guilty. This is years long, of course, not ideal, but at least we were making some progress. And what we did in this case, and I think someone mentioned this in the comments, was we ended up making what we call a tiered recommendation to Travis. And this was because when I would ask Teresa what she wanted from the prosecution, she would say, I want him to go to prison. And I'd say, and I want my money back. I want my house back. And I would say, Teresa, we can't get your house back, but we might be able to get some of your money back. And if you had to choose between a high prison sentence for Travis and getting some of your money back, what would you choose? And she said, I would choose getting some of my money back. Not an easy choice, but it was the only way we had any chance of getting money back from him, because all the money was spent. He didn't have any assets in Hawaii. So it was the only thing we could do was think about how to incentivize for him working to repay her at least some of this money. So We made an offer where he pled guilty, basically as charged to all of the different felony charges we had filed. And we agreed to reduce his charges and his prison sentence recommendation contingent on the amount of restitution he could pay by the time of sentencing. And we agreed to set sentencing out for about a year so he would have time to work on this. So he made an initial restitution payment of $25,000, which his girlfriend's family gave him. And then for the next year, he worked and he paid $1,000 a week to his attorney, who then turned it over to us. And after a year had passed, by January of 2025, he had paid $75,000 to Teresa, which was significant. And I think even maybe more significant was just that he had worked and sort of been under this burden and under this obligation to work to repay his mom for the damage he had caused her. And he did it. And I think it's sort of a restorative justice idea that I think made a big difference to Teresa. So getting the money back obviously made a difference, but also the idea that he was out there paying her week after week after week gave her some sense of justice. So he was sentenced this past January, and because of the money he'd repaid, we dismissed 2 felonies, and he was sentenced to 6 months of electronic home monitoring, a year of community custody, and was required to pay the additional restitution at $500 a month, and was ordered to have no contact with Teresa because she didn't want to have contact with him, and not to work with vulnerable adults. So a big break for him, but it was the only way we could get that money back for her, which was the most important thing to her. So again, we strayed far from the idea of a traditional prosecution, but I think for her, it was the best scenario that we could do. So as a result of the MDT's involvement, Teresa avoided further financial exploitation and homelessness. She avoided guardianship. She's now living in a facility where she's safe and well cared for. She has a professional she trusts to advocate for her and manage her finances. And she has recovered and will continue to recover a significant portion of the money she lost. We haven't made her whole, but we've given her something, and certainly more than we were able to give Leon. So just going back to our response in King County, since the MDT was initially funded, we were refunded a second round of funding in 2023. We now have 3 full-time prosecutors in our unit, 2 forensic accountants, a half-time advocate, and a paralegal. So it's really because of this community work, I think, that we have become a more robust team, and we're more fully engaged and more fully a part of the fabric of our community's response to elder abuse. And it's only through this collaboration with other disciplines that we can really understand and respond properly to what victims need, and effectively and ethically prosecute these cases and help older adults live their lives free of the harm and with the dignity that they deserve. So this is my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'm happy to talk to any of you who would like to talk about prosecution or about MDTs or anything that I can help with. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Paige. This has been such an insightful presentation, and I know I can see from looking at the chat that people are getting a lot out of it. And we have some questions. Some of them are related to the case, so maybe I will pose some of those first. In talking about the first case, we've got someone asking about the capacity evaluation and if the client needed to agree to have the capacity evaluation.
And yes, great question. And yes, he does. There was no one else involved besides me with him and the Seattle police detective. And so if he had said to us, no, I'm not going to do it, we would have had no recourse. But the capacity evaluator, who's an MSW, who's worked with us for a long time, I don't think she's ever been turned down by a victim, or maybe once in her career, because she's incredibly unaggressive and very compassionate. And she goes out to the victim's home and she talks to them and she explains, the need for the evaluation. And sadly, I think the other truth is that most people with dementia are not very aware of it. And so they think that they're fine, and they think that if they have this evaluation, it'll be proven that they're fine. And so they agree. But yes, we do need their agreement to go forward with those evaluations. And I think that's a big bonus of having someone an evaluator who's willing to go to the victim's home, because I think people are much more likely to be open to it if someone comes to their house versus having to go to a doctor's office.
It sounds like that relationship building component is important, whether it's amongst team members or with the clients. It can go.
Absolutely. Yes.
We have another question about the victim cooperating with the prosecution. Is that necessary? Does the victim need to testify in order for prosecution to move forward? I guess that's kind of a big question.
It is a big question. I mean, if we had a financial exploitation case where the perpetrator was the victim's son, like let's say Teresa's case, that was less severe. Let's say Travis had stolen $50,000 from her, and Teresa had plenty of money, and she had enough capacity to make a decision about whether she wanted him prosecuted. In a case like that, if she had said to us, "I know he took money from me. It was done without permission, but I do not want to participate in this. I have money left. It will damage my relationship with my son." In a case like that, we may well have just said to her, "Okay, we're not going to do this." But in a case like this, where she was ravaged, where she lost everything, I think we probably would have decided to prosecute anyway, especially knowing that she was so significantly cognitively impaired. And in any other form of abuse, if it's neglect or sexual assault or physical assault, in those cases we also typically don't defer to the victim's wishes, because there's this danger to their well-being that's part of what's going on. But in some financial exploitation cases, if we think the victim's decision makes sense and we have the opinions of other players, of the case manager or of an advocate who are working with them, who tell us that actually a prosecution is not going to be helping them, then we may agree not to prosecute. It's definitely not always the best thing for older people.
Yeah, it sounds like it's incredibly nuanced.
Yeah.
And another question regarding capacity and a client's ability to testify. Um, I have a note here from someone saying that oftentimes on their team, they feel that they're at odds with the prosecutor because a prosecutor doesn't think that the client will be able to testify well, will make a good witness. And so this person's wondering if there's other support or other things to consider when you've got evidence in a case, but you're not sure how well the client will be able to testify.
I think that I've had a number of victims with dementia testify, and they've been amazing witnesses. Leon's a great example of that. Even though he couldn't, remember the dates, he couldn't remember a lot of the details. What he could remember was that he'd been traumatized by this person, that this person had stolen his car. He had enough information about what had happened and remembered enough about what had happened that he surpassed the very low threshold of competency for witnesses to testify. And then the jury could see him and hear from him, and his vulnerability and sort of why he was taken advantage of became so obvious to them. So, I just would remind prosecutors that the threshold for being competent to testify is very, very low. And most people with dementia who are not severely impaired are competent to testify. But talk to them yourself and see if they can relay basic facts to you. And if they can, and even if they don't remember a lot of the detail, that's usually enough to allow them to tell the important parts of their story. We also know that older victims with dementia, have a better ability to remember traumatic events. So oftentimes somebody with a dementia diagnosis who may have trouble remembering minor details of their day may well be able to give you a very good picture of what happened to them when they were exploited or abused. So definitely don't make that assumption about them, because in most cases, people with dementia, unless they're severely impaired, are able to testify. If they're not, we usually go forward anyway. A lot of our cases involve victims whose dementia has progressed so that it's so advanced they simply can't convey anything, or they're dead by the time we go to trial, and we're usually able to go forward anyway. And again, this is something I'm happy to expound on if anyone wants to reach out to me and give me a call or email me.
We have a long question here. from someone who says, I'm a legal aid attorney representing seniors who are crime victims. And I've had experience with issues with law enforcement refusing to take reports or investigate elder financial abuse, many times when an attorney, in fact, has perpetrated the crime. So, specifically thinking about power of attorneys and being told that a power of attorney grants authority for the attorney to do whatever they need, which can include draining bank accounts, selling homes, etc. And also having difficulty with law enforcement who say it's a civil matter, not wanting to investigate, even getting a hostile response from them when they've attempted to collect evidence or review possible charges. So I know this is not related to your specific county and your work, but do you have any thoughts or advice on how to handle these situations with law enforcement and potential POAs?
It makes me so sad to hear that. And I know it happens everywhere. It still happens in our county. And it's absolutely incorrect. So when there's abuse of a power of attorney, those cases tend to be easier for us to prosecute because as you guys know, there's a fiduciary duty on the part of the agent towards the person for whose money they're handling or have the ability to handle. And that fiduciary duty is paramount. They can't drain someone's assets through a power of attorney and claim they're acting under their duties as a power of attorney. They have the fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of the person they're acting for. So, and because consent is so often raised, when we have a power of attorney in a case, it's actually easier for us to go forward because we can say, I don't really care if the victim consented. You knew that you had to act in their best interests, and we are going to prosecute this case regardless of your claim that they consented. So the law enforcement response is a training issue, and it may also be an issue that's due to the lack of support by the prosecutor's office. And how we respond to that is we will call, if we hear about that happening, we'll call the detective and say, hey, we've got a case that happened in your jurisdiction. You know, we actually can prosecute these cases when there's a power of attorney. It's actually easier for us. You want to look at the gifting provision and see what it allows, but no power of attorney allows the agent to drain a victim of everything and just walk away. It's simply absolutely fundamentally inconsistent with what a power of attorney is all about, and we will go forward on that. And so usually once we say that to the detective, they're like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that, and we'll help support them as they investigate the case. And when they hear that we are willing to file charges on the case, we almost always find that they step up and do the investigation they need. So again, another reason why we need training of detectives, of dispatch, of people who handle dispatch for 911 calls, of patrol officers, so that they start understanding when these cases are criminal and these cases need to be referred to prosecutors. And just another plug for NIPEA, which Andy mentioned earlier, that's the National Institute on the Prosecution of Elder Abuse. We're putting on a training in Houston in a couple of weeks. We've got another one in November, and this is through the OVW Abuse in Later Life grant, and it's a course for prosecutors that I think is fantastic. I'm a trainer for it, so of course I'm a little bit self-interested, but we really talk about working with law enforcement and how to build the response in your community as prosecutors, and how to prosecute cases involving powers of attorney and other sort of complicated financial cases, as well as neglect and sexual assault and physical abuse and physical assault. So again, if anyone has questions about that, feel free to reach out to me.
That's terrific. And I did just want to note that actually somebody commented this, and it's accurate that the OVW Abuse in Later Life grant program does have an open notice of a funding opportunity right now. Their link is in the chat, and I will copy it over into the chat again here in a little bit. But just a heads up about that, because I know there's been a lot of questions about funding opportunities. And
Yes.
also that Paige mentioned early using VOCA funds. So that's something you can look into at your state. And there is information on the MDT page at elderjustice.gov about using VOCA funds for your programs. I also have a question here for you, Paige, about what cases you take. Does your MDT address every case that comes through? And if not, how is it determined which case your MDT will see?
Great question. I would say we still are working on getting more referrals. It's still hard to get referrals, although we've come a long way. But in general, the guidelines that we put out there are that we want the case to have been reported to law enforcement and to APS, and ideally, the case is one that where it's just sort of stuck in the system, where APS can't move forward for various reasons, law enforcement can't move forward for various reasons, and there's a need for sort of this systemic multidisciplinary response. Even more now, we're dealing with self-neglect cases where we might have a case that really has no criminal aspect to it, but we have an older person who is refusing assistance, and where we still need to be coordinating services and capacity evaluations and working with APS and trying to figure out how we can intervene so that the older person isn't languishing in a horrible situation. So we're pretty open at this point to any form of abuse, neglect, or self-neglect. And I think the key element is just that the case has been reported and the system is struggling with it.
That's really good information. And does your MDT only address cases of abuse, or are there any resources, or do you take cases for financial fraud?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the cases we're doing are financial exploitation cases. Increasingly, we've been doing cases where victims are being scammed, where there's not like a local criminal component. And those cases, we are working mainly to intervene on the victim's behalf and try to protect them. And there's a case I'll be talking about tomorrow that is a great example of this. So that's, I think, a huge area where we need to be talking about how can we coordinate services and an intervention where these older people are victims of these ongoing scams and losing their life savings to them. It's a great opportunity for MDTs.
Yeah. Also, how many cases does your MDT actively manage at one time?
I would say we've got maybe 7 or 8 that we're sort of currently working on. And I think we have capacity for more. A lot of them, we don't end up staffing at every meeting. We'll have one sort of initial large staffing, and then the follow-up meetings might just be very brief where we're just getting updates on what's happening on the case. So I think we have capacity for more cases as well.
It's fantastic. I know that your MDT has been around for a long time, and we're wondering if you can give anybody any tips around sustainability. How did you manage to keep your team alive and active for so long?
Well, we've been blessed with this funding from King County, which I'm so grateful for. I think without funding, it's really hard. I had tried before this to run various forms of MDTs, and it's hard when you're working full time and you're already completely, busy at your job and you just don't have the bandwidth. So funding is key, and that's something else I think we need to be talking about as as MDT members across the country. So our county did this levy for veterans and human services that also affected seniors, and they were the ones who recognized the need for the MDT funding. But I think, I hope that in the future, VOCA might be a resource. And then it's also possible that through the OVW Abuse and Later Life Grant, your victim services funding that's part of that could potentially be used for victim services that could be linked with an MDT. So I think there's some opportunities there, but we definitely need to be working on that.
So it sounds like you follow a particular case over several meetings, and is that typical?
Yes, and the more successful cases we've had have been ones where we've been following them over multiple meetings. Usually, like just consulting on it one time doesn't do the trick. Usually, we're talking about getting a money manager involved or getting a capacity evaluation and finding out what the capacity evaluator says. Getting a case manager involved who's coordinating services, and so we're getting updates from them every month or every 2 months, and continuing to have input on what can be done to help this person.
It's fantastic. A question here about the size of King County and that you're a larger county, and I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for smaller counties and how they might proceed with developing their MDT and navigating their cases together on a smaller scale.
I think it's just all about whatever the size of your county or your jurisdiction. I think it's all about building relationships. So even if you don't have funding, like doing something like I did with our elder abuse council, which is just like